5 a.m. Friday morning, Thursday night, far from sleep. I'm still up and driving, can't go home, obviously. So I'll just change direction, 'cause they'll soon know where I live. And I wanna live. Got a full tank and some chips. Was me and a gun and a man on my back. And I sang, "Holy, holy," as he buttoned down his pants. You can laugh, it's kind of funny, the things you think in times like these. Like I haven't seen Barbados, so I must get out of this. Thank you. So what you just heard was the first verse and chorus of Tori Amos's 1991 song, "Me and a Gun." As you may have noticed from the lyrics, it is about a rape. Maybe you got that from the lyrics, but it's about something that actually happened to her a few years before. After a show that she was performing, she offered to give a fan a ride home, and he actually raped her at knife point in the back of her own car. She later changed the song to "Me and a Gun" because I'm guessing it sounded better in the song. But as it was happening, as the act was happening, he demanded that she sing hymns. So the song is structured as a hymn. It's performed a cappella, and it's a really beautiful song. It came out when I was about 7 years old, so I didn't hear it at that point. But when I was a little older, probably about 13 or 14 years old, I heard it for the first time. And it just really connected with me in a very strong way, and I couldn't really identify why or how, but every time I listened to it, I felt very connected to her experience. And obviously that hadn't happened to me. Thankfully, I had not experienced the same thing. So I wasn't connecting with the personal experience per se. I was connecting more with her articulation of something bigger. And as I got older, I kind of realized what that was. It was an articulation of the female experience as a whole, particularly in relationship to trauma and talking about something that's considered taboo in our culture. So what I'm talking about today with you guys is what confessional singer-songwriters can teach us about the female experience as a whole. But before I can do that, we have to talk a little bit about what confession is. I'm sure we all feel like we know what it is, and we know there are two major contexts in which confessions happen. So there's the religious, which is kind of the praying hands there, and then there's the legal, the weight, the scales that I have here. In either context, there's a construction of a power construction where there's a confessor and then there's someone who hears the confession. And this could be in the religious context, the priest. In the legal context, it could be an attorney or the person who's interrogating you. But in either situation, the person who's confessing is admitting to something that is a sin, that is considered wrong, that is something that is very, very closely related to shame. So now that we've talked a little bit about confession, we can talk about confessionalism. And confessionalism is a movement that started in American poetry, late 50s, early 60s. It started mostly with male poets, and they started writing about their personal experiences in a way that hadn't been done before. So normally in contemporary American poetry at that time, people weren't really talking about themselves. They were writing more formally, focusing more on the structure of their poems and the way they sounded than talking about autobiographical topics. So when these poets started doing that, lo and behold, they had female students who started taking their lead. And who we remember the most from this movement are the female poets, mostly Anne Sexton and Sylvia Plath. If you remember anybody from the confessional movement, it's probably these two women. And they both wrote about taboo topics for women. They also both wrote about extremely personal experiences. and they both committed suicide later in their lives. And a lot of people like to make the connection between making confessions of sin and the connection with shame with the way that they kind of dealt with their personal issues in their lives and how they later committed suicide. And now that we've talked about confessional poetry, we can talk a little bit more about music, because out of that confessional movement, we started seeing singer-songwriters who did confessional work as well. But what's interesting about confessional singer-songwriters is that only women are called confessional singer-songwriters. So there aren't male confessional singer-songwriters. I've only read about one, and I'll tell you about that in just a minute. But what this insinuates for us is that only women's articulations of their personal experiences are confessions, meaning only women's articulations of personal experiences are shameful. The only male singer-songwriter that I have heard called confessional is Frank Ocean, and that was after he came out. And then people started looking at his songs and saying, oh, this song is about a man. This is not normative, so this is a confession. And they started calling him a confessional singer-songwriter at that point because of the relationship with something that's considered taboo or shameful in our culture. So the singer-songwriter I have here, and apologies, it looks a little grainy, but it's Joni Mitchell. And you probably know Joni Mitchell as probably the most famous confessional singer-songwriter. But Joni Mitchell has a huge problem with the term confessional. In fact, she's quoted as saying that calling her a confessionalist is the closest someone could come to calling her the N-word, which seems extremely hyperbolic, but she was later interviewed because a lot of people got very angry when she said that, understandably. And she said, well, the reason I say that is because I only know confession to be something that's done under duress and something that's incriminating and indicative of shame or wrongdoing or sin. And when I sing about something that's happened to me or something from my personal life, it's called a confession. But when a man sings about it, it's just called a song. And I don't agree with that. And I'm not confessing anything. I'm just talking about my life. So now that we've talked a little bit about confession, confessionalism, and confessional singer-songwriters, we can talk about how we ended up in a place in our culture where only women's articulations of the female experience are called confessions. So obviously we have to look at social constructs. Everyone's going to blame the patriarchy for everything. We all have to do that, right? But patriarchal ideals, that's the first bullet point in my list here. And I wanted to talk a little bit about expectations about gender performance for women. So you have heard a lot of different sayings about women and what is expected of women. That they should be neither seen nor heard. No, I'm just kidding. That they should be silent and submissive is one that you probably have heard. I have kind of added my own little bullet point here because I was thinking about this topic and thinking women are not just expected to be silent and submissive. Their gender performance or their performance in general is expected to be polite and correct at all times. And anything that's not polite or not correct is considered shameful. It's considered not acceptable socially and culturally. So therefore, if we think about articulations of the female experience as being neither polite nor correct, not things we talk about in public, for example, then obviously articulating the female experience is then shameful. So here's my huge list of taboo topics for women, and I made it shorter. So the point being, there are a lot of things that are not okay for women to talk about, that we don't talk about because it's not polite and it's not correct. And I even have this problem when I'm talking to female friends of mine. We cringe about certain topics, and we're women, and it shouldn't be that way, but it is that way because these are not considered polite or correct things to talk about in polite company, right? So I have some lists here. I have the three headers. First being women's bodies. These are things we can't talk about, so bear with me, okay? Sexual desires, menstruation, pregnancy, miscarriage, abortion, rape, sexual health. Not things we talk about generally in polite conversation or mixed company or whatever you want to call that. Women's minds is the second category, and that would include mental illness, postpartum depression, particularly postpartum depression because of the gender role kind of relationship there, and it's considered extremely shameful to confess anything about having postpartum depression because you're supposed to love your baby, and why would you feel anything other than that, right? There are a lot of things I could say about this topic because I've researched it a lot. But Suicidal Thoughts is another one, and that comes up a lot in a lot of the poems by Anne Sexton and Sylvia Plath, for example, and in a lot of songs. Gendered opinions, non-normative thoughts. That could be just about anything, right? That's not acceptable. And then I have women's miscellaneous, and I'd encourage you to kind of add your own things here. But I have personal desires and wishes, fears and anxieties, and expressions of loss, grief, and unhappiness. And these are things we see a lot in poems and songs by confessionalists. They're a lot of times therapeutic for the person who's writing or singing them. But you know, the problem is we like to think we live in a culture where gender is equal, right? We have kind of, we live in a time where women can say and do and sing and be and feel whatever they want. But that's not really the case. And the songs that we're talking about, these confessionalist songs and these poems, are articulating these experiences, but this is a bigger problem in our culture as a whole. So the question becomes, how do confessional singer-songwriters get away with talking about these taboo topics? How do they get away with mentioning and discussing these things that aren't polite or correct? And there are three main ways that they do this. The first one is sonically, so it depends on the type of instrumentation and musical choices they make. So we know that from psychological research, the way that a song is constructed affects us as a listener. So depending on the instruments they choose, the rhythm, for example, the Tori Amos song is a cappella. That's going to strike us differently than if she came in kind of screeching over a bunch of guitars and really loud drums or something like that. The melody there is very important in that song for doing what I call softening the blow. And by that I just mean making the message more acceptable or accessible to the audience. And the second one is lyrically. Figurative language or abstraction is the main way that this is done in poetry and songwriting. So, for example, after I sang you that little bit of the song, I kind of explained to you what it was about. And imagine if Tori Amos had written a song where she just flat out said, I was taking a guy home from a show and he raped me in the back of my car with a knife and made me sing hymns. Nobody really wants to hear that, I don't think. I mean, maybe, but I don't think so. So she takes figurative language and abstraction and makes it more accessible by making it kind of a poetic expression of what happened and kind of leaving it open to interpretation. It was me and a gun and a man on my back, but I haven't seen Barbados, so I must get out of this. And the Barbados here is kind of like that hope that she has for a possible future if she makes it out of the situation. So she kind of gives us the figurative image there. And the last category is diffusing tension. So the way that we do that, not just in music and poetry, but in life, is through humor and self-deprecation. And the example I have from the Tori Amos song is, you can laugh, it's kind of funny, the things you think in times like these. I don't think, I would wager that nobody would laugh at her talking about this experience, but her doing that in the song is the same kind of movement that we make when we're talking to our friends and we say, don't judge me, but, or don't laugh, but, that kind of preparation that we give them before we say something that makes us feel vulnerable. So that's kind of what's happening there with the diffusion of tension. So now that I've articulated this problem in our culture, where do we go from here? What do we do about it? I would argue there's a lot of work that can be done, but I think there are three very simple things that we can do on a daily basis that will really kind of push us more towards a place in our culture where we can be more accepting of articulations of the female experience. And the first one is pretty easy, it sounds like. Embrace vulnerability. That's something that probably nobody would want to do, though, because we often associate vulnerability with weakness, but they're not the same thing. Vulnerability is actually the highest form of courage, and it's putting yourself out there in a situation where you know what you're saying or doing might not be socially acceptable or might kind of open you up to ridicule or wounding or something like that. But in embracing vulnerability, when we allow ourselves to talk about these things or allow other people to talk about these things to us, we kind of normalize these experiences because we're talking about them more and more. And the more we talk about something and the more normalized it becomes, the less shame will be associated with talking about these topics. And then maybe one day they won't even be taboo for us. The second step is to practice empathy. And empathy, I would like to point out, is not the same thing as tolerance. So we like to mix those two up a lot of times. But tolerance is more looking at something and saying, you know, I don't agree with that, but it's okay if you do it. I'm fine with you doing it, right? But empathy is putting yourself in the position of the other person and actually kind of trying to see it from their perspective. And when you do that and you think about this expression or whatever it is that the person is making, and you think about it from a position of empathy, you can also think about how difficult it must have been for them to say or do that unpopular thing, because it takes a lot of courage to do that. So practicing empathy is the second step. And the third one is investigating our discomfort. So when something makes us uncomfortable, when somebody talks about something that makes us uncomfortable, instead of just going, whoa, I don't really want to talk about that, or that makes me feel uncomfortable, or let me shut this down or change the topic, if you can kind of stop for a second and sit in that feeling and take a step back and say, why do I feel discomfort? Why do I feel uncomfortable with this topic? 99 times out of 100, it's because of something that's socially constructed. It's because of something that's been taught to us. This is not polite, or we don't talk about this in polite company, or women don't talk about these kinds of things, or whatever religious, social, cultural kind of construction thing is happening. It's not something that's coming from within us, is what I'm trying to say. It's not a personal response most of the time. So if we can kind of stop and think about that and investigate the reason for the discomfort, that can kind of help us to start making strides forward. So the last thing I want to do is bring you back to this Tori Amos song one more time. And since we've talked about kind of figurative language and about trying to make strides forward to a place in our culture where these types of articulations of the female experience are more accessible, acceptable, etc., I thought I might kind of propose something here and just kind of sing you out, if you would let me do that. But when I do that, I want you to kind of think about the lyrics here in a different way. So instead of thinking about me and a gun and a man on my back as that personal experience that I related to you that Tori Amos had in her life, if we can think about that as this social construction, this structure that we've inherited that's kind of made these expressions nearly impossible. You know, we say like, I have a monkey on my back, or the man is holding me down, or something like that. We can kind of think about that in the same way. Me and a gun and a man on my back could be this social construction. And then Barbados, in that case, isn't just the hope that Tori Amos talks about personally, but it can be our own hope for a possible future in which these types of expressions are more acceptable. So if it's okay with you, I'll just kind of sing you out with this little bit here. Was me and a gun and a man on my back, but I haven't seen Barbados, so I must get out of this. No, I haven't seen Barbados,